Okay. Perfect, great. So the title of this session collectively is Cultural Responses to Disasters in Vanuatu, Past and Present Research. But my title specifically is Geoheritage and Indigenous Knowledge of Tsunamis on Pentecost Island, a retrospective view. And I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, but I might go over a little bit. I am a postdoc at Cambridge, where I'm now working on South American volcanoes. But like everyone else, we've been grounded by the pandemic and we haven't been able to do any field work. So when Ben asked if I might give a talk, I thought this is the perfect opportunity to revisit a piece of research I did almost exactly 10 years ago. And I've been thinking about revisiting this for some time now because things have moved on in the 10 years since, and my thinking has developed a little bit, but also other things haven't changed and things haven't moved on in some ways. So that's why this is a retrospective view. I'm also very glad to have the chance to revisit these topics and talk about Vanuatu, which made a huge impression on me, and the topic of Indigenous knowledge as a form of geoheritage and how we can or should use that has been a theme throughout all of my research. So it connects quite nicely with this series. And before we get into that, I should say my background is essentially geography and disaster studies, and I am a social scientist. So those are the disciplines that frame all of this research. This is where the research actually took place. It's a bay on the southern end of an island called Pentecost in Vanuatu. And I was here in 2011 while I was studying disaster management. And I came back to Vanuatu a couple of years later with a second research project. But I haven't been back since. And inevitably, I'm a little bit out of the loop with Vanuatu affairs. So that is one proviso to the talk. And it's also the reason I'm super thankful to Maëlle, who very kindly agreed to present with me because she has far more up-to-date experience of Vanuatu. And it's been really wonderful to connect with her and reminisce about Vanuatu. So big thank you to Maëlle. No research is done alone, everyone knows this, and this research was supervised by Professor Patrick Nunn and supported by a great many other people. And this talk is based on this paper from 2012. And I just also want to say that we gratefully acknowledge the traditional custom owners of the stories that I'm going to talk about today, who gave their permission for them to be published in this study. So just a quick reminder about where Vanuatu is. Here's a little animation showing its location in the South Pacific, just northeast of New Caledonia, right on the New Hebrides plate boundary. Its 82 islands sit in a Y-shaped archipelago that's about 1,700 kilometers long, and about 7 of the islands are inhabited, and most are steep and rugged due to their volcanic nature. And the population of Vanuatu is around 230,000. This is Pentecost Island that I mentioned. And I'm also going to talk briefly about Ni Vanuatu culture, because I want to quickly stress the connection between culture, including geoheritage, and the way people respond to natural hazards. So Vanuatu is often said to be the most at risk, either the most or one of the most at-risk countries in the world to natural hazards, because it sits in the cyclone belt. It's in a very active tectonic region. Its islands are small and isolated, and development according to Western metrics is quite low. But it would be completely wrong to characterize these islands and these people as just vulnerable, because local culture and local geoheritage include all manner of knowledges, actions and behaviors that connect to the environment around and the hazards and risks that go along with that, as well as the opportunities. So as well as vulnerability, there is resilience. But it's hard to communicate something as intangible as this connection and the depth of knowledge that this provides. But I have an example that helps, and it's the activity that the men in this picture are about to take part in. It's unique to Pentecost, and it's called the Nargol, or land diving. And some of you may have heard of this. It's quite similar to bungee jumping. But unlike bungee jumping, you are supposed to hit the ground. Basically, on the slopes of hillsides, these very tall, precarious-looking towers are constructed, and the men have vines tied around their ankles before diving headfirst off. And the soil is loosened at the base of the tower, but otherwise there is nothing to lessen the impact. I'm going to see if this video works, and you can probably hear my reaction at the time. So I just wanted to show this to give a sense of the depth of connection between local culture and the understanding, the use, the reliance on the environment. And it's literally no exaggeration to say that this connection is trusted within an inch of their lives. Oh, there we go again. But as I said, land diving is only on Pentecost. And I want to stress the fact that Ni Vanuatu culture is highly place-based. It's not at all uniform. And in fact, it's amazingly diverse. There's something like 113 indigenous languages, something like 2,000 people per language. And culture has adapted and changed as a result of colonialism. And one example is what are sometimes called cargo cults. And one of the most famous is called John Frum. Their symbol is the Red Cross. There's another group that worship Prince Philip, and others in Vanuatu and PNG constructed wooden runways and watchtowers and even planes. So these groups are clearly interesting, and they get quite a lot of attention. For example, I found this rum in Wales last year, named after cargo cults when I was on holiday. But are they really cults at all? And certainly there's a real fixation on these groups, and they're often portrayed as somehow weird or backwards or laughable, and most people patronize them. But I think it's incorrect to say that some islands or islanders have traditional custom culture and some are cults. All islands in Vanuatu have culture, and all responses to disasters are cultural and in some part rely on geoheritage. So the disaster I'm going to talk about today is a tsunami. We're back on Pentecost Island in the bay I mentioned, called Bay Martelli. And in 1999, just after midnight on the 26th of November, there was a 7.5 earthquake just south of here. And the earthquake produced a wave that affected most coasts in the area. But this bay was the worst affected. So the tsunami wave height reached 5.5 meters in the western part of the bay and up to 6.6 in the northeastern part at the now abandoned village, also named Bay Martelli. There were about 100 structures of varying sizes here. And as you can see, the whole area was destroyed. The only building to survive was the church. But despite the large wave, the tsunami only claimed 5 lives out of a population of about 300 people that were living at the coast. So the central question of the research was, why did so few people die when there was such destruction? It helped that on the day the tsunami happened, there was a wedding that continued into the evening. So people were awake, some people were awake, and the night was well moonlit. But this isn't the whole story, because clearly being awake doesn't really cover it. The reason was the ability of key people to recognize the precursors of the tsunami and to understand this and to get people to evacuate to higher ground. In 1999, the villagers were watching the coast after the earthquake because they suspected a tsunami was coming. And at the time, this was said to be primarily due to the fresh memory of a VHS video that had been shown 3 weeks earlier, completely by coincidence, about the 1998 Papua New Guinea Atapes tsunami. And this was part of a disaster risk reduction strategy, which is where this picture is from. And it was said that this strategy was a great success and that this is why so few people died. But there'd also been suggestions that traditional knowledge about hazards, handed down through oral traditions and myths, that had played a role. And in the literature, there's several case studies out there from Indonesia and from the Solomons, where indigenous knowledge was the reason why people knew how to respond, papers from Brian McAdoo and others, but this hadn't been confirmed. So I did interviews all around the villages in the bay, all the places that the people from Bay Martelli village had resettled into after the tsunami. I did 55 interviews in total. These were semi-structured, some were quite short, others were longer, and the longer ones tended to be with the chiefs of the communities and the older people. And what emerged, particularly from that group, were a series of traditional stories, of myths, of legends that have a direct connection to how people respond to tsunamis. So this is one example, and there were several others. This is a story called The Devil of Lombarasse, and this is a very rough cartoon of the legend. So quite roughly, it goes, bear with me. A devil walks into a village of Lombarasse, pretending to have lost his pig, which are status symbols in Vanuatu. He talks to villagers who do not realize he's a devil, and the villagers very kindly feed him. But after he's finished eating, he eats all of their food too, and swallows even the table the food is on. And at that point, the villagers realize he's a devil, and they decide they must kill him before he kills them. And they go to the witch doctor, the village witch doctor, who tells the people that the devil is afraid of seawater. And the people go to the cave in which the devil is living, and the witch doctor performs a ritual and sings a specific song to a specific type of tree. And I'm going to see if I can play the song. So the song gets louder and louder, and the earth starts to shake. And growing afraid, the devil climbs a tree, and the people don't climb a tree, don't climb trees. They see the sea retreating, and they run to higher ground. And a huge wave comes and kills the devil, and the witch doctor is also killed, but he dies while singing, meaning that the wave will come back one day. And people imagine they can hear the song on the wind. People survive because they've run to higher ground. And what's really cool is that this story contains a load of details about the risk and what to do in a tsunami. It tells them that tsunamis happen, it tells them that they will come back, it tells the connection, most importantly, between the earthquake and then the sea going back and then the tsunami coming. It tells them what to do to run to higher ground, it tells them what not to do to climb trees. And it's this story and those like it that largely prevented so many people from dying in 1999. The video and the Western-style education strategy probably helped, but now, or 10 years ago, most people didn't remember the video. And those that did probably only did so because by complete coincidence, it happened 3 weeks before. So these events are fused together in memory. Far more people speak about these stories. And while the video is remembered by some, it isn't really discussed because it's not culturally compatible or sustainable. These stories also tell us about past events, and this type of geoheritage can be a useful resource for understanding the past and what disasters have taken place, which kind of relates to the question Nina just dropped in the chat. As well as the distinct legends, there are also locations and objects that have specific meanings in relation to hazards, and these are important geoheritage too. So these are some examples. Top left is a coral boulder, and top right is a view of the bay from where it sits at a height around well over, I think, 50 meters above sea level. And roughly 30% of interviewees mentioned a once giant wave that had washed west to east over the headland in north central Bay Martelli at a height of well over 50 meters. And this boulder was said to have been deposited here from that. And another example is the bottom picture. This is a river pool, freshwater. It's 30 minutes walk upstream where a saltwater fish was said to have been found alive after a huge wave. And a potential candidate for this tsunami is the 1452 Kue eruption. But regardless, this would have been a massive wave. And it's quite possible that stories like this come from events even further back in time. And there's some great examples of geomythology from across the Pacific, with stories being handed down orally for many thousands of years. And Patrick Nunn has a great book on this called Edge of Memory, and he examines geomythology to show that not only do these accurately reflect events and disasters, but also subtle climatic and environmental changes. And there's recent publications to suggest that in Australia, some of these stories go back as much as 13,000 years, which is really incredible. So I mentioned that some things have changed in the 10 years since doing this research. And one of the major things is exactly what this seminar series is about the vital link between societal responses to natural hazards and the scientific response through geoheritage. These things have changed both in terms of thinking, my thinking, and policy. So after the research, I submitted a report suggesting that this framework for integrating Indigenous strategies and scientific strategies was the way to go about this. And there's several like this out there in the literature. This one's from Jessica Mercer and others. And I made a few modifications to theirs. Basically, I was suggesting a 6-stage process of including Indigenous knowledge and strategies into disaster risk reduction policy. And I still agree with some of this, but where my thinking has changed is that we can't or shouldn't approach Indigenous strategies as just a toolkit of ways to build resilience. And there's sort of 3 broad reasons behind this. The first is that the danger with a process like this, in identifying good strategies of resilience, we forcefully detach those good parts from the other aspects of culture that make them make sense, almost in an attempt to weaponize them, to remove them from the things that make them work, like the structures of ownership, like the ontological context, and the local dynamic. And by the nature of these frameworks, but also by the nature of academia and policy, we are encouraged to boil down the complexity of culture into units that are manageable and understandable to us, that nicely fit into things like this. And there's also a tendency to focus on aspects of culture that are deemed useful or positive, and the rest is ignored, which is partly why I mentioned cargo cults earlier, to say that we still have an issue with either ignoring or patronizing some elements of culture. The second issue is that in all of these stages, who is it that gets to decide what is valuable and what is weakness? And I think it should be acknowledged that we, or at least I, Western scientists and academics, are not necessarily the ones who can or should be defining what cultural responses, what geoheritage are, how they work and how they should be used, because a lot of this is hard for us to understand, and it's so fundamentally different to Western approaches. It's also tied up with a strange superiority of, supposedly, of the scientific approach, that suggests that this somehow isn't cultural, which of course it is, that Western science is cultural just in the same sense that local responses are. So the third and final problem, and thing that has changed in my thinking at least, is that when Indigenous knowledge or geoheritage of this kind is included in policy, it can be done in a way that ignores the desires of people. So for example, in this process, the stage of identifying cultural practices or knowledge that provide resilience, in itself, that's not a problem, depending on how it's done, of course. But the issue is what comes next. So almost inevitably, it follows that recommendations are made to continue good cultural practices and potentially to stop doing bad ones. And as a result, the onus for providing resilience is transferred to Indigenous groups. And for those Indigenous groups, often that's tied to a romanticized idea of indigeneity, either before colonialization or before globalization. We don't recognize necessarily that the world has changed and that it was us that changed it. I mean, I think Maëlle's going to touch upon this, but perhaps people don't want to live in traditional buildings that are the most resilient. And those are sort of the 3 things that have changed in my thinking. As I said, I still believe in elements of this, and I still think it's a useful endeavor, but there's issues that have emerged in the 10 years since I did this. The other thing that has changed has been the policy landscape. So Vanuatu established the National Advisory Board to oversee climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And the 2016 to 2030 policy document is full of detail on integrating, valuing, protecting, Indigenous knowledge, including of disasters. So it's a really ambitious document, and this is great progress. Unfortunately, the other thing that has changed since the research is that disasters have kept happening. That other disasters have occurred. This is a photo from Dan McGarry's Twitter, and it's more or less taken in exactly the same spot that those photos I showed you earlier of the bay where I did interviews. This is Pointcross village on Bay Martelli that was directly hit by Cyclone Harold on April 5th of last year and caused considerable damages. And so this is, unfortunately, the disasters keep happening. And I think one of the points here is that an integrated approach is required between multiple hazards, and that traditional silos of different hazards like tsunamis are perhaps less useful as we transition to a vulnerability approach. So I'm slightly over time, but I'm going to try and make some quick conclusions. The first is that geoheritage and geomythology was the main reason why so few people died in the 1999 tsunami. But more than that, that technical Western approaches were shown to be ineffective in a cultural context that didn't see them as relevant. We don't exactly know the levels of protection against tsunamis now that this knowledge provides. Even 10 years ago, the data suggested that young people thought tsunamis were less of a risk than older people. And there's a great recent paper by Kane called Does Death Come in Waves? That showed a repetitive cycle over the long term of people moving from hillside villages down to the coast, and then there'd be a tsunami and then move up, only to return once memory had faded, including in Vanuatu. And so to do nothing is the wrong approach. But equally, the inclusion of cultural geoheritage or indigenous knowledge is tricky. And part of the issue stems from a refusal, particularly from outside donors and aid agencies, to acknowledge all parts of culture, particularly those that are seen as messy, like religion. And a particular challenge that endures is how specific each policy and each project must be. And this is largely the reason why top-down adaptation, or DRR, has failed in the Pacific, because successful solutions must be highly place-based, and that is incredibly time-intensive. Finally, in accounting for and using local geoheritage, we cannot be didactical. We must consider what people want and who has power, and this extends to the same issues that are quite old and familiar in research, that we need to change the relationship between researcher and subject when research is done about people experiencing disasters rather than by, with, and for them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rory. It was really amazing, really clear presentation. I really enjoyed it. So I think we have some questions. Ben, you have remarks first, and after a question, so if you want to turn your microphone.
Sure, my microphone is on, I hope. Thank you, Rory. That was fascinating, and I've got far more questions than I managed to write in the time. There was, it seems to me, my question, which I forgot to write a question mark on, was, seems there's a huge amount that you can learn from these Vanuatuans on how to behave in resilience, and rather than we going there to tell them what to do or see what they can do, perhaps it should be the inverse. We can come to them to see how things are done. I'm thinking particularly on one of the sites like Arequipa in Peru, where we're all hoping to work. We're dealing with an urban environment where there are urban myths and beliefs, and to see how people who are more connected with the landscape deal with it could help urban people develop the right sort of urban myths to make them more resilient.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. That's a brilliant point. And I think it links to what you said about urban myths and the fact that not all of these are coached in traditional means or traditional terms. And I think even those myths and legends have great value and can be humoristic in their own sense. That I have an example. It's not from Vanuatu, but I did my PhD in Mauritius, and they had a mass hysteria after a cyclone involving a werewolf, and that legend has long historical precedent. And if you want to understand the way people respond to disasters, you need to understand not only culture but also history. So yeah, I think that's absolutely a vital point.
I think I don't want to ask all the questions, but I see there's a comment from Moslem. Perhaps Moslem, you'd like to come online and make the comment. Just wondering if Moslem is there.
I think she is there, but maybe...
I'm here. It takes time to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am having, I don't know why, computer problems. Hi, everybody. I'm Muslim. I work for UNESCO Earth Science and Geohazard Risks Reduction section. So our team's work is very relevant to what Ben is doing with this project and all these webinars. And also, I think I need to liaise with my team. We have a section on Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous communities led by Nigel Kroll, and these are the activities we are promoting to our member states, our representatives who are policymakers. I'm very happy to be here and listen to you and this information. I am really also pleased to see that this is real. So when you sit in Paris and in the big meeting rooms, ambassadors and delegations and talk and we explain them, and this gives us really useful stories and case studies and examples based on our project. So I'm just thankful, and I will follow this as much as I can with our project. And sorry, I have camera issues. You can see me. I'll try to come back with the camera. Thank you.
Thanks, Moslem. Just to say quickly, thanks for all the work you do. And is it Douglas Nakashima? His report on
he retired actually, and Douglas retired 2 years now, and he's replaced by Nigel Kroll,
right?
And the chief of section on this, Indigenous knowledge and connections with all of UNESCO activities. I mean, they come from Indigenous knowledge for culture, education, water, and of course, disaster risk reduction is our part. Oh yeah.
Perfect. His report was hugely influential on me. Actually, I thought that was really fantastic piece of work.
Okay. No, it was before my time, so I joined UNESCO only after he retired.
Sure.
So yeah, but it's been followed, and it's, I think, getting really big and important for UNESCO. I think Douglas initiated this branch, let's say, but it's getting really big at UNESCO now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moslem. Nina wanted to know how old the story was. But yeah, Nina?
Questions. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I think you answered my questions, yeah, because I was wondering if you have like a correlation of the story and more resilience, you see what I mean? But if there's this story are really old, I mean, maybe we can create new story for children, and we will see this resilience increase. But that was just a point.
No, absolutely, yeah, and I think that's really fascinating, isn't it? Linking the story with the historical record. It's quite a challenge, I think, but it can be done, and I think that's a great area for interdisciplinary collaboration. And I've kind of been seeing for a while now if anyone would be willing to go to the bay and see if we could date the coral boulders. Mm-hmm. If we could do some kind of dating to exactly find out when they were deposited on the hillside. And there's an island, or there was an island in the center of the bay that's been drowned or has sunken, and that's a potential site that people said that was sunken by a tsunami. So I think we can link that somehow, but it's going to need a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration, which is obviously quite tricky.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have more questions. Philipson,
Philipson,
to turn on your microphone. Or maybe he can't, I don't know.
Hear me?
yes, Philipson.
Okay. Yeah, my question is posed here. You can say it is like, it seems like there was a church meeting during the enemy tsunami strike. That was right.
I think that was the wedding, right? I think
Oh, it's a waiting, right?
it was a wedding, so people were awake. But the reason I don't ascribe too much emphasis on that is just because there's many other examples where people were at the coast and awake or could see what was happening and didn't self-evacuate. So I think the fact that people were awake and could see is important, of course, but it's not enough to explain the low fatality rate.
Okay.
Would you what do you think? Do you think does that answer it for you?
I think it helps
Yeah, absolutely.
because I know there was a huge amount of work done on Tsunami, sort of awareness program. It's gone together with the volcano, so that's why I know there's a huge amount of work done before that. So I'm pretty sure that this plays a role as well.
Yeah.
And another thing I was thinking about is that compared to what I saw on volcanoes, is all of these stories pops out after the event struck. So we almost used them to find the event that happened earlier beforehand.
Yeah.
But I have the feeling that they didn't occur before the event. So yeah, it's a bit not at all. Yeah, I don't know. Well, just think. My feeling is that these events in the past that were recorded in the traditional didn't pop out before the event itself struck, right? Mm-hmm. So they only people talked about it and trying to explain the event in their traditional belief. So they try going back and find out the stories and try to explain the event. So my point here is that I'm not pretty sure that these traditionals belief really plays a big role here. I'm sure they played, but not that big. I might wrong, but I think yeah, that's only my personal point of view.
Sure. Yeah, I think each event is very different, and I absolutely agree that perhaps events are somewhat reconstructed retrospectively, and certainly they change over time. But yeah, I mean, there is some amazing literature out there on geomythology that is accurately linked to events that could only be specific disasters in the past, and obviously the geological record doesn't necessarily even have those events in it. So geomythology is the only way really to get to the bottom of many of these events way back several thousand years ago, in my mind anyway. It is tricky to directly attribute people's behaviors and responses to traditional knowledge, but from the research I've done here specifically, I am confident that this is the reason why so few people died. But obviously there is some level of difficulty, especially considering the event was in 1999 and the research was 10 years ago, so time is passing. But yeah, thank you.
Nice talk anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Philipson. I have one more question. You know, on your second slide, I think it was a picture of children with two adults in a courses or a lecture. I was wondering, is it like a sensibilization campaign, or is it part of education in Vanuatu to have a sensibilization on tsunami and on earthquake? Or
the picture of the blackboard with the school. Yeah, so that was the campaign where the NDMO, National Disaster Management Office, went around villages with a video of the Atape tsunami in PNG in 1998. But it was also twinned with a lecture to children using standard educational tools about what to do in a tsunami. So that was a sort of Western style. Westerner comes into the village in English and then communicates, or French, I'm not sure actually, and then communicates kind of a semi-scientific approach to disasters and to risk.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.